So how do we fight inflation, recession, and unemployment with fiscal policy? This is the real hardcore aim of what we want to do. So fiscal policy is the use of government spending and taxes to influence the path of the macroeconomy over time. There are two types of policy. There's an expansionary fiscal policy, which is aimed at increasing the level of aggregate demand through increases in government spending or decreases in taxes. We also have contractionary fiscal policy when we want to decrease the level of aggregate demand in our economy. And we'll see why that could be the case. Okay, so let's take a look at expansionary fiscal policy. If we look at AD right here, AD represents the current demand, and this is current supply, and we're at GDP level 1, which is significantly below full employment GDP, so we probably have cyclical unemployment, and we're in a recession, and we want to pull ourselves out of this recession. We want to lower the gap between GDP and full employment GDP. Well, if we can stimulate demand, if we can push demand to the right, we can lower this gap between full employment GDP and actual GDP. We'll also get inflation. We're going to increase demand, so, well, people are we're going to be paying more for goods and services. How do we do that? How do we drive aggregate demand? Well, remember that aggregate demand is composed of consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. So we're going to try to act directly on these different items. The first way we're going to do it is through consumption. If we can get people to consume more, then demand for goods and services will rise. The way we do that is we can reduce income taxes and we can reduce payroll taxes to increase what's called disposable income. That's the income that people make after they've paid their tax. So if disposable income increases, we can expect that consumption will probably increase. The second way we do this is through stimulating expenditures by businesses or investment. How do we do that? We can reduce the corporate income tax rate. If corporations have to pay less taxes, well, they can also spend more money on machines and whatnot. And lastly, government spending. This is a direct impact on the goods and services. As we saw, governments are buying goods and services all the time. And so if they increase their expenditures, they're going to push demand outwards. Now, what about contractionary policy? Well, it's going to be the exact opposite. Contractionary policy is useful. Here's the situation here. If we look at P1 and GDP1, we have demand over here, and demand is very high. In fact, we've gone beyond full employment GDP. So we've pushed the economy really high. As we push the economy high along this short-run aggregate supply curve, prices will go up really high. We've got probably high rates of inflation. We're pushing the economy very, very hard. People are probably working overtime. And this is not necessarily a good position to be in. So we may want to reduce, maybe not all the way down to GDP2, but reduce back to full employment GDP. We're pushing the economy quite fast, and we have high rates of inflation. We want to slow things down. And so we'll undertake what's called a contractionary policy, and we'll try to pull aggregate demand to the left towards this full employment level. How do we do it? That's the exact opposite of what we saw before. We can increase income taxes or payroll taxes and decrease disposable income for households. As people have less money to spend, they buy less goods and services. We can increase corporate income taxes for businesses, and so they spend less money on machines and whatnot. And obviously, governments can decrease expenditures of their own goods and services. So that would be a contractionary fiscal policy. Now, you're probably wondering what happened to net exports. It's the last component of GDP, consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. We'll see that in a minute. Fiscal policy is divided into two large groups. And the first group we just saw is what's called discretionary policy. It's something we decide at our discretion. We do it, we don't do it. Discretionary policy is when the government decides to pass a new law or change the tax code or spend more money. These are discretionary expenditures. A very good recent example is the United States spending $2 trillion to stimulate the U.S. economy during the coronavirus outbreak. This was at their discretion. We also have what's called automatic stabilizers. Automatic stabilizers are things that kick in automatically when the economy is, for example, in a recession. So, for example, unemployment insurance is a typical automatic stabilizer. As unemployment rises, more people will receive unemployment insurance, which helps push the economy forward. Same is true with proportional and progressive taxes. These are automatic stabilizers. If people are making too much money and spending too much, we can expect that they're going to pay more taxes, and this will lower consumption, and vice versa. If incomes go down, people pay less taxes, allowing them to have a little bit more disposable income to drive consumption. So we have two types of fiscal policy: discretionary and automatic fiscal policy. Now, there are some problems with fiscal policy, and I'm going to mention one of them to you right now. Fiscal policy obviously is based on using money. If the government wants to expand the economy, for example, it has to spend money. And if we want to decrease taxes to stimulate the economy, well, if the government decreases taxes, they still have to pay their suppliers. The government still has to operate. So if we increase the deficit, we have to finance the deficit somehow. So let's take the example here. We have a government, and they're operating, and we have a bank here that has a whole bunch of money that can be borrowed. And we have businesses and households that also borrow money. Businesses borrow money to invest. Households borrow money to buy goods and services. If the government pursues a expansionary fiscal policy, they'll need money to finance their expenditures. And so they'll turn to banks. They'll go to the banking system and say, we need some money. And they will borrow that money, okay? And in exchange, so the banks give this money to the government, and in exchange, the government gives the bank what's called a bond. Okay, so they've sold a bond to the bank. This is kind of like a promise for the money, and at some point the bank will sell back to the government this bond, saying, hey, we want our money back. Now, the bad thing about this is that as the money flows from the bank to the government, there's less money for households and businesses. Okay, and this is a significant problem. Less money to borrow here because it's been given to the government usually results in higher interest rates. Okay, and the result of that is, at the end of the day, a less impactful fiscal policy. So imagine you borrow money, you can spend more money, but at the same time, because there's little bits of money left, interest rates go up, and businesses and households now have to pay higher rates of interest to consume or invest. And if interest rates go up, that could actually decrease their levels of investment. Now, this is called crowding out. This is a very unique term we use in economics. Basically, we've crowded out the investment by households and crowded out the consumption by households in this case. How do you solve it? We solve it through coordinated monetary and fiscal policy. Let's take a look at how we coordinate fiscal and monetary policy. So in this example, I'm gonna look at two different things going on. I'm gonna look at I'm gonna make it a little bit bigger to make this easier to see. So we're gonna take aggregate demand, and we're going to take aggregate supply, which is here. We'll make this simple. And we have GDP, and we have our general price level here. And currently we're operating at this level of prices and this level of GDP. And we have prices. Okay. And what the government's going to do is it's going to say, well, we're going to push aggregate demand to the right. So let me get another color here. So we're going to push our aggregate demand to the right through increased government expenditures. So we're going to increase government expenditures and we're going to push aggregate demand to the right. This is going to maybe pull us out of a recession. It's going to result in a higher level of GDP, which is great. We're producing more goods and services, but we also know that this is going to result in a higher level of prices as well. Now, this increase in government spending that drove an increase in aggregate demand, so aggregate demand's moved out, is in need of financing. The government spending money probably it doesn't have, may not be the case, but it could be the case. Where are they going to get it? Well, they're going to go to the banks. Well, let's go to the loanable funds market. So banks supply loanable funds. This is the supply of loanable funds, and we have demand of loanable funds. This is the money that's borrowed, and it's borrowed at a given interest rate, which is the price of money. Interest rate. So what happens? The government says we want to spend more money. We're over here on the left side. Well, to do that, we have to borrow money. So the demand of loanable funds, the demand of money in the banking system, goes up. I didn't choose a very good color here, so let me try this again. Let's try that again. So the demand of money to borrow goes up. Okay, this is because the government increased their demand of money, and as a result, the interest rate rises. Interest rate goes up. Now, as the interest rate goes up, the other components here of aggregate demand, namely consumption plus investment, well, as interest rates rise, this is going to decrease. And we know that as interest rates rise, households will borrow less. We have a decrease in investment, and so we could expect that in fact aggregate demand moves back down. So how do we combat that? How do we coordinate things so everything's looking good? Well, what we can do is we can actually play with the supply of loanable funds. So the government can issue more money, can put more money in the hands of banks. So we can have what's called an expansionary monetary policy. So we can actually increase the amount of money in the economy here. So for example, we could be out here. The supply of money goes up, and rates can come back down. And we can actually get them down to the level where they were before, eventually. So as the supply of loanable funds increases, interest rates can be held down, and we won't negatively impact consumption and investment. So to do it, as the government pushes up government spending over here, the monetary policy, which we'll talk about later on in another video, has to expand to make sure interest rates remain low. And we've hopefully solved the problem of crowding out. Let's go back.